Okay, now that we've spent a little time talking about what blockchain is, before we get into a really deep dive on the technology, let's talk a little bit about how blockchain is used, so that as we get deeper into the technology, you can understand, why we're getting in so deep. Why should we care? Because there's a lot of places where blockchain ends up bringing a lot of value. I would say that blockchain really is all about new solutions to old problems. We're going to talk about just a couple of them here: asset management, land titling, healthcare, voting, a number of others. But the important thing to understand is anything that involves the transactions of value and requires trust, anything that involves the transactions of value between untrusted parties, blockchain's got a place to play in that space. Let's talk about property titling. There's a lot of places in the world where the ownership of property may not be known. It may be in dispute. There are issues of property fraud in many places. There are places where property records have been destroyed. So if you go to places like Haiti or Puerto Rico or even New York City, there are big property disputes in those places. So the ownership can't be known. And as a result, there's a big need for entire industries like title insurance, right? When you go to buy or sell a house, you actually have to get insurance just in case you're about to spend a large sum of money. You get a title, and then somebody comes later and says, no, that property didn't belong to the person who sold it to you. That was stolen, or it really belongs to me. And so there's an entire industry. So blockchain has a very strong place to play in that, and it's been used in countries all around the world. There are companies. Ubiquity is a company that actually has blockchain solutions for the property title industry. Property titling on a blockchain protects against loss or theft. It reduces the need for title insurance. It automates multi-stakeholder processes, and it reduces delays and costs. They've got a platform there called it's an NFT, right? Non-fungible title platform, and they deal with the issues like digital identity, data security, documentation, legacy, and modern integrations, revenue sharing, traceability. These are all things that one company deals with. GBA's got a number of other organizations that are in the titling industry. So if you want to hit that QR code and find out about different types of companies that GBA members that are in the blockchain space, if you just want to read about it, we've got a whole bunch of blogs, so you can hit that QR code on the right and read about a title, property titling in the blockchain space. Asset management, how that happens. Okay, so as we can see, blockchain, in addition to using it for coins or tokens or anything like that, actually managing assets in an organization, in an enterprise, is a great use for blockchain. The U.S. Department of Treasury, Bureau of Fiscal Services, had a financial and their financial innovation and transformation offices actually did a pilot program where they used blockchain to manage the assets of things like cell phones, computers, different technologies. And this is an example of asset management. And somewhat related is acquisition management. So as another example, Health and Human Services, the U.S. Health and Human Services Administration, or Department of Health and Human Services, they launched a project called Accelerate. Now, the scope of this project was they had $26 billion in annual spending across 100,000 contracts. And what they did as part of this effort is they consolidated 5 different contract writing systems into one. And they used machine learning to cleanse the data, to find and correct bad data. They entered the data onto a blockchain system, and then they used something called microservices to represent the acquisition lifecycle. And I don't have the data in front of me, but they saved, a huge amount of money. They reduced the acquisition life cycle from many months to literally a matter of, I want to say, minutes or hours. And they focused on, I don't want to say anything that's not correct, because there was another GSA project that focused on something called, I think it's IT-70, but basically this is the procurement of computer components and sort of standard off the shelf, commercial off the shelf products. So between HHS and GSA, They've run several pilot projects and very, very successfully. Now let's talk about blockchain uses in the banking industry. So most banking transactions do not do real-time settlements. If you've ever run a business or had to process credit cards, you know somebody will swipe their credit card and then the vendor may not get paid for days, right? Or if you've done a bank transaction, right? You know, you'll look at your bank statement or you'll go online and that transaction doesn't actually show up. You might see it as a pending transaction, but it doesn't get finalized for days. If you do a transaction on Friday, it may be Tuesday before you actually see that transaction show up in your account register. So banks do not necessarily do real-time settlements. The current state of the financial services infrastructure is ineffective, it's reactive, it's risky, it relies on old technology. I mean, a lot of those banking systems are still using COBOL mainframe computers, right? Telecommunications is the same way, government is the same way. So you have these very, very large systems. A lot of them still use technology that might have been developed, before the 2000s. When you have systems that are that large, it becomes very, very difficult to replace or change those. Very expensive. They're competitive, prohibitive. They require monthly and quarterly reporting. So each market has its own customized infrastructure. Even within a bank, right? The markets, the retail banking, all of these different sort of infrastructures within a banking system have vastly different settlement infrastructures. And all the transactions are generally processed through some kind of a clearinghouse or a central clearing party, which creates layer upon layer of delays. Now, what blockchain does in the banking space is it allows for low cost of entry to establish banking functions and allow competition, right? It promotes innovation, faster transactions, lower transaction costs, and you can build the regulatory compliance right into the banking transaction. Now, something that's really fascinating to think about is if you think of a payment transaction, right, and you look at what has to happen in the banking system to manage a payment transaction. It's a huge amount of overhead. You've got to put these massive systems in place. You've got to have insurance. You have to have policies. You have to have a number of deposits. Reserve. There's all kinds of. You have to do AML, anti-money laundering, KYC policies, right? The amount of things that you have to do. You've got to enforce security requirements and audits. And what's fascinating, if you just take that one sort of payment process set of things that you have to do to execute a payment, when you create a blockchain-based payment system, you could essentially stand the whole thing up with a few lines of code and literally create a banking function like that. Now, would it have regulatory compliance? Probably not. But still, the functions that can be stood up using blockchain technology and safeguarding. So, like for example, if you execute a Bitcoin transaction, you've got 99.999% security and reliability that transaction is going to go through. In much the same way, you have the same degree of confidence in a bank transaction, right? So this really kind of creates a whole new paradigm. Now, currently, the realities, right, the blockchain/DLT realities, is that the trust banks have been formed to hold digital assets and crypto assets. So where we are right now is there are banks that you can trust that are holding these kinds of assets. There's multiple digital exchanges that have been registered with regulators, right? Legacy banks are partnering with fintechs to allow customers to trade and custody different crypto assets. And global banks are creating blockchain internal transfers. So they're creating blockchain solutions to do internal transfers. Multiple banks and brokers have proof of concepts that they're building out with stock exchanges. A lot of depositories have proof of concepts for digital clearing and settlements. There are fiat coin to bank transfers that have been established. And there's over 60 central banks around the world that are in the process of developing or at least experimenting with central bank digital currencies. Now, here's sort of a comparison and contrast of the two kind of ecosystem. The legacy financial services ecosystem, right? The positive side is they have great scope and scalability, right? The current banking systems can deal with very high volume. They basically have the capability to deal with all the transactions that are happening in real time, right? The negative side is that they're inflexible and very costly. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the blockchain, DLT, crypto, DeFi, metaverse, right, that whole kind of new space that's emerging, it's very, very innovative, right? The problem is, the negative side is, it's very transient and it's immature. You can't really count on it. A lot of the rules aren't set. You don't know if it'll be legally compliant or if somebody's going to knock on your door and serve you a subpoena and take you to jail. Right? There are still hacks, not necessarily of the blockchain system itself, but of the on-ramps and off-ramps. So all of the pieces haven't really been totally solidified. The big question is, will the legacy financial system absorb and replace the emerging blockchain metaverse? Or will the blockchain metaverse expand, stabilize, and disrupt and disintermediate the legacy of financial services? Or is the answer both? Maybe they both kind of come to the middle. But this is an area where we're going to see huge changes, one way or the other, and I'm hoping and expecting that those changes are positive. With regard to retail central bank digital currencies, or retail and central bank digital currencies, this is a central bank issued digital currency. It's operated and settled in a peer-to-peer and decentralized manner. It's widely available for consumer use. CBDCs serve as a complement or substitute for physical cash. They're an alternative to traditional bank deposits. And central banks from several countries are experimenting with this, including those from the Eastern Caribbean, Bahamas, Cambodia, and many others. So let's switch over to how blockchain is used in a cybersecurity space. So, and I like to say this, warning, the contents of this may make your head explode. Historically, security of transactions was maintained by keeping information about the transactions from other people so they could not use it or steal it or wrongfully use the information or assets. This new paradigm involves letting everyone see it, right? Validate it and confirm that it's true. So in the prior paradigm, it's let's put big walls around it. Let's not let anybody in there that potentially could misuse it or corrupt it, right? However, if you let everybody see it and know it, then it becomes very difficult to falsify it. For example, how do you know or how do you prove that Washington is the capital of the United States? You don't really have to prove it because it's general common knowledge. And this is a 180-degree paradigm shift in terms of how cybersecurity works. Just as an example, most private key implementations, which is typically how cybersecurity is done, uses something called a trusted third party certificate authority, right, to issue, revoke, and store key pairs. So the idea behind in cybersecurity is you have a public key and a private key. And when those two things are presented together, it unlocks whatever information you're trying to secure. But a hacker can compromise them or spoof a user's identity to craft the encrypted communication. So, for example, you may have gotten an email, right, that pretends to be from your bank, your exchange, your boss, your email server, and it says something like, for some reason, you need to log into your system. And so, believing that it's true, I mean, the email is coming from an email address. It looks like your boss. They might use the right logos and the right colors. It might take you to a web page that looks exactly like your bank's web page, right? And you go in there and you put in your username and password, and then which is your private key, and then boom, they got it. And once they have it, they can get into everything, right? And so some examples is $101 million was stolen from a Bangladesh bank, right? The Democratic National Committee had a massive email leak, which many people believe impacted the 2020 election, or was it the 2016? I think it was the 2016 election. Either one. Vietnam Airlines had a big data breach. There was an attack on DynCorp. So anyway, there have been lots of different attacks, and the things that they all have in common is centralized vulnerability. If you distribute that vulnerability amongst a lot of different parties, it makes it much more difficult to attack, or for the attackers to get everything. So now, with regards to, let's talk about a different industry. Okay? In the defense industry, one of the big things that's important in the defense industry is a supply chain. And in the supply chain, you've got a couple different things. You've got kind of like you had with asset management, the bringing together of parts, and then you also have maintenance. Gosh, there's so much I want to cover with you. Okay, so if we're talking about a defense military supply chain, we've got the manufacture, assembly, and also the maintenance of parts. One of the other things that's really fascinating is the Department of Navy 3D prints military parts. So if you think about aircraft on an aircraft carrier, right? When a plane needs a spare part, they may not necessarily be able to come back into port to get it, so they can 3D print it on the aircraft carrier. But imagine, and the designs, the drawings for that are all maintained in the cloud, right? So imagine somebody breaks into that cloud space, and they change the engineering drawings, and they insert little pinholes in the parts, so that when you install it on the aircraft, it's designed to fail under stress, right? So one of the things that military, the defense folks have to do is any kind of parts, whether we're talking about software, whether we're talking about integrated circuits, whether we're talking about any of those things, right? Securing those supply chains in the defense space is critically important. Another place where blockchain is used in defense is in securing communications. So I don't necessarily have a slide on that. Another really fascinating place where blockchain is used in another industry is in energy, right? So 5 ways that blockchain is disrupting the energy industry is it can be used to decentralize energy retail. So if everybody's got solar collectors on their home, or they've got a generator, and they have excess capacity, excess energy production, they can then sell it to each other. All of the current models in energy productions is essentially a centralized one, right? Where you've got one company generating the power and selling that to everybody. But blockchain allows people to tokenize their energy and essentially to sell it to each other. It also improves transition and distribution system stability. So if you have, instead of a one-to-many, you have a many-to-many, it allows the load on the grid essentially to normalize out. It creates new mechanisms for project financing, because I can now take my energy ecosystem, I can create tokens and actually have people invest in my project based on tokens. It streamlines energy trading, and it improves renewable generation and accountability. So just a large number of ways that blockchain can be used in the energy space. Protection of intellectual property. So when we're talking about intellectual property, we're typically talking about inventions, artistic works, scientific findings, right? And these are all created by different groups of stakeholders, and they have similar but different but related requirements. But here's where it's really fascinating, and I just love this image. Remember, anything that is intellectual property, you can probably digitize, right? And you can digitize it, and then you can create that fingerprint that we talked about before, and you can put it in a block. And as an example, the Bitcoin blockchain generates a new block every 10 minutes. So if I wrote a book or I wrote a song, I could take a digital fingerprint of that, right? It's a hash. We'll talk about specifically what a hash is and how it works later. And I can take a hash and I can say Gerard Daché put the hash of this book, of this song, of this movie, of this invention, right, of this engineering drawing, on this block at 3:30 p.m. on July 30th, 2018. And then that gets written to a block. It gets copied to blockchain. Everybody has a copy. And from that point forward, as long as this blockchain exists, anybody can go back to that block at 3:30 p.m. on July 30th, 2018, and validate that I actually did put a copy of that intellectual property there on the blockchain, right? So it's just a great way to prove the authenticity of ownership. And if we want to talk about how blockchain and cryptocurrency is being used in law enforcement, there's an old saying in law enforcement, and that's follow the money, right? If there's any kind of bad actors or anything like that, you want to find out, the Bible says that where your money is, so is your heart also, or something like that. I'm mixing it up just a tiny bit, but a tool that law enforcement uses all the time is essentially tracking financial transactions. And there are companies like CNC Intelligence, Gray Wolf, and CipherTrace. These are all GBA members, and they actually have tools for law enforcement to be able to use to track cryptocurrency transactions across time and space in order to help police and law enforcement and banks and a bunch of folks identify and essentially stop fraudulent transactions. And this could be terrorism. It could be illegal drug sales. It could be human trafficking. What they do is they use artificial intelligence and pattern recognition to identify patterns of financial transactions indicating criminal activity like human trafficking and drug smuggling. So great companies and like that. Healthcare is another incredible use for blockchain. Blockchain can be used both for organ donations and transplants, and actually even to support family members. But with regard to healthcare, like so many of these industries, there's so many more. The GBA is developing something called a healthcare delivery blockchain platform to evaluate the technical and interoperability, the technical interoperability between distributed healthcare systems and providers. We're focusing really in the areas of mental health, rural healthcare delivery, and community-based healthcare delivery. But in addition to that, and this is actually part of a course that we teach, blockchain plays a place in almost all aspects. If you look at healthcare megatrends and the big picture, blockchain's got a place to play in clinical trials management, data management, access controls, consent management, the drug supply chain, especially with regard to anti-counterfeiting, and also related medical devices. So in the area of insurance, right, you got claims management, you got fraud reduction. This is such a huge opportunity to save money. There's so much essentially fraud, waste, and abuse in healthcare and insurance. Improving administrative processes. There's a relatively new field called value-based healthcare systems, where hospitals and medical suppliers are paid not necessarily on the activities they performed, but the outcomes they generate. What that means is you got to capture a lot of data in order to be able to validate and substantiate your charges. There's all kinds of new business models in healthcare. One of the things that we're looking at is something called the role of tokenization. So there's a GBA member called SolveCare. What a lot of hospitals and insurance companies do is they pay for services based on generally like a license agreement. And so, as an example, my daughter is a nurse, and under the standard sort of business model, she would need a license, even though she only works a couple days a month. I think she works like 5 days a month. But under the standard business model, she would require a license and have to, the hospital, the insurance company, whatever, would have to pay for that license, 365 days. What tokenizing does is it allows her employer to basically only have to pay for her usage for the time and transactions that she's actually engaging with the system. So it's a whole new way of being able to operationalize costs. And you can also tokenize good behavior, right? So, if people walk a certain amount, each day, if they eat right, and there's all kinds of devices that allows them to capture that kind of data. Looking at how we move from acute care to prevention, right? So blockchain's got a place to play there, and helping us deal with regulatory and compliance issues like HIPAA and GDPR. However, there are a lot of technical challenges in implementing blockchain. There's a lot of business challenges, and there's a lot of cultural challenges. So it's a pretty vast space. And this is a place where blockchain is still relatively new, but lots of opportunities for changes, improvements, and challenges to overcome. If you're interested in more GBA members that are involved in the healthcare space, hit this organization's QR code on the left. And if you're interested in reading more about it from our website, hit the one on the right. Identity management. So I'm moving pretty quick. The nice thing is that when you're watching this as a recorded event, you can always hit pause and rewind at any time. So that's why I don't feel guilty about moving too fast. If we were in a room together, I'd have to stop every few minutes and ask if you're getting it and give you a chance to ask questions. But let's talk about identity management for a moment. This is an area that applies to all of the other use cases, right? It applies to both individuals and organizations, and it addresses the question of identity versus persona. And so let me tell you a little bit about what that means. When we talk about someone's identity is the full suite of descriptors of a person or an organization, and we'll talk about on the next slide what those are. Persona is the unique set of identities or descriptors that we might want to release to somebody so we can engage with them. And as an example, if you're going to engage with an Uber driver, let's say you're the passenger, they're the driver, all you really need to know about them is maybe the make and color and license plate of their car. Maybe you might want to know how long they've been driving for Uber and what kind of ratings that they've got. You might want to know their names so you can be polite and address them by name, but that's and you probably want to know what they look like and what their car looks like, right? But those are the descriptors of them. That's really all you really need in order to engage with them, right? On the other hand, if you were the driver and the person you're talking to is the person you're interested in identifying is a passenger, then I've never seen what the Uber driver's thing looks like, but I'm guessing how many times have you used Uber before? Maybe if Uber drivers give ratings on their passengers, maybe that I don't know, tipping history. I don't know what those things are, but clearly what you look like, what your name is. There's certain things about that person that you would want to know, but you don't need to know their bank account number. You don't need to know, any of a number of things, right? Their age, things like that, their politics. It's probably best you don't know their politics. But anyway, that's the difference between identity and persona. And when we talk about identity, there's different types of descriptors. We'll talk about those here in a second. So these are some examples of different types of descriptors. Let me see if I have the other. Yeah. Your family tree, your birth records, your property records, where you've lived, maybe GPS coordinates, educational activities and courses, scores, diplomas, your financial history, your medical records, military records. All of these things are descriptors, and some of them are temporary, right? So, for example, your current location is a temporary one. Your current address might be a persistent one. It's not going to change from minute to minute or hour to hour, right? But your birthplace would be a permanent descriptor, right? You're not going to change your birthplace or your birth date. You might change where you live periodically or occasionally, and your physical location in terms of where you are right now, that's going to change. So when we talk about identity and persona management, these are some of the things that are important. If you're going to check out at a grocery store, it's important that they know whether or not you have the money to pay for it. It might be important for them to know whether or not you're above legal age to purchase certain things like cigarettes or alcohol. But that's pretty much it. When you swipe your credit card, what do they actually know about you? They probably know your name, your address. They probably know your sex, your income levels. They probably know, depending on whether or not you buy diapers or certain types of products, whether you have children, whether you're a pet owner. There's tons of information every time you swipe your credit card. And the reason they know that is because users generate data that's collected by companies like Google, Facebook, retail stores. They're sold to data mines who then resell that information back to advertisers. And if all of your identity was hosted, if your digital identity was hosted on a blockchain, then that gives the individual users power over who sees their data, who has access to their data. And blockchain-based identity management would allow for greater transparency in the collection and use of personal data. It would also allow individuals to monetize their personal data. One example of a company that does this, such as uses decentralized identity on a blockchain, is called Earth ID. This is a picture of their solution. Anyway, that's just an example of how blockchain can be used in the identity space. Oops. All right, let's talk about supply chains. This is a phenomenal use case for blockchain, and in it, because there's a lot of problems here that blockchain can help solve. Large numbers of stakeholders, varying levels of technology. So if you're dealing with shipping companies, freight forwarding companies, couriers, right? All kinds of different companies, suppliers, they all have varying levels of technology. Some may be completely paper-based, right? They have dependent processes. So for example, a shipper may not be able to ship until an inspector has come and inspected it, or until somebody has paid a licensing fee, some kind of a tariff. So tons and tons of dependent processes, which result in cascading risks. And again, each organization has separate systems. So even though they fulfilled their part, they don't know if other people have fulfilled their part, their portion. A lot of the data is proprietary, and there's lots and lots of manual interfaces. So using a smart contract, which essentially is a thing that you can do with blockchain, would allow all of the different stakeholders, right? The banks, the controllers, customs, export terminal, freight forwarders, insurers, import terminals, regulators, shippers, right? All essentially to have visibility, the appropriate visibility into the process flow, right? From exporter all the way to importer, and be allowed to interact with those different components as necessary. And all of this is done essentially not by humans doing it, but by handshakes between the different computer components and systems. So it's just really incredible. Here's an example. Walmart, they did a test, right? So what they did is they basically put a mango on the table, and they said, how long does it take us to track this mango back to the source? And initially it was 6 days, 18 hours, and 26 minutes. Right. After they implemented a blockchain solution, they could do the same thing in 2 seconds. And think about in the event that E. coli or Salmonella would do an outbreak, the difference between 2 seconds and 6+ days can be decisive, even life-saving. So it helps prevent fraud because you got granular real-time review of records. You can identify and resolve bottlenecks, again, in real time. And you can mitigate regulatory and compliance issue, reducing costs of storage, fines, penalties, and fees and interest. So in so many ways, blockchain is just a great answer to the challenges in supply chain. And here's just another practical example. If you think of the flour supply chain, right, how complicated can it be? But the reality is, flours are typically in transit for about 30 days. They require 30 unique sign-offs right? There are over 200 separate communications involved in a single flower shipment. And if you have one lost record, it could potentially railroad or stop the entire shipment. So this is a great example of how blockchain essentially could be used just in this one supply chain. An example, Dimitra is a GBA member. If you go to our website, you can find out about them. They're in the agri-tech business, and they work with governments, farmers, farming cooperatives, agricultural corporations, NGOs, nonprofits. They've built an entire platform that leverages all these technologies, IoT devices, satellite, drone, genomics, basically to pull it all together. And that's the real value of blockchain, is it allows you to take all these disparate things and pull them together, create smart contracts to automate these processes, and actually build the money and the execution part directly into a smart contract. So you don't need an accounts payable person. You don't need other folks to do it. The smart contract can take care of it automatically. And so if you want to find out about other GBA organizations or read more about it, hit these QR links, QR codes. And then this is the last use case that we'll do. It's voting. So blockchain technology makes it much more difficult to change election data, right? To support, blockchain technology supports integrity of voter rolls. It supports real-time ballot tabulation, and it supports full public auditing of votes cast, right? And blockchain has been used in voting for both municipal elections, congressional elections, and presidential elections. One of the companies that essentially is doing blockchain voting is a company called Voatz, V-O-A-T-Z. They've done a number of local and national elections. Great company. And theoretically, or sort of conceptually, it's kind of like this. If the way we did voting, so right now the way we do voting is we ask everybody to vote, they write down their selection on a piece of paper, they give it to a central authority, that central authority counts it, and then tells us who won. Conceptually, it's not exactly that way, but conceptually that's how it works. The way blockchain voting would work, again, conceptually, is you give us all a sticky pad, we write the name of the person that we're voting on, we all put it up on the wall, and then we can all count the votes together. So we don't need somebody else to count the votes for us. We don't have to trust anybody else to count the votes for us. We can just count them ourselves. And that's really conceptually the difference between using an intermediary to a trust broker, right? Somebody that we have to trust to give us the information, and essentially us using community, and we can essentially trust it ourselves. So in the 2020 GBA Achievement Awards, Carlos Torriella won the award with a project called Fiscal Digital. This was a project for not El Salvador, it was not Honduras, Guatemala. And so he had created a system where at the election, the polling places, people would vote on paper ballots. Those votes would be collected at the polling place and witnessed by people of both parties. They would certify it, and then they're at the polling place, and then they would record it to actually several different blockchains, and everybody could count the votes together, and which is what his project was all about. So that's pretty cool. All right, so that takes care of just some of the many examples about how blockchain can be used, some of the use cases. So that'll cover it for this module. All right.